Thank you so much for having me here and all the hospitality I've received so far. Everyone has been very kind, and you have a fantastically beautiful place here. It's so auspicious. Inspiring to see how much has happened in a short time here in terms of making a Pure Land-like domain where we can have optimal circumstances as possible within cyclic existence to learn the Dharma, transform our minds in a way that accords more with reality, and therefore make less unnecessary suffering for ourselves. So anyway, of course, we thank the Venerable Chodron especially for her leadership in the role in bringing this about. I'm, I guess among the very large number of people who are inspired by her, and I can just say that don't know any of the rest of you except Tarba by phone and email a little bit in setting this up, but just say briefly, thank you, that I met her over the internet by sending her a piece of fan mail. I'm a professor in a university. I have a lot of, I teach about Buddhism all the time. And so the students are, I don't know why, it just seems that more often the women students, curious about nuns and how they've been treated in the history of Buddhism and how they haven't always been treated so well. And so they always ask me questions about these things, or pretty much every semester. So I try to learn a little bit to say. It wasn't a big topic when I was in school. I don't know what that was about. But so I try to learn a little bit about that, and then of course as soon as you do, you find out there's really not that much that's written. It's kind of shocking. And that one of the world experts on nuns doesn't have a PhD and is just quietly going about her business. And so anyway, I stumbled into something wonderful she'd written. I just sent her a little piece of fan mail, and so we formed a connection. She's been very helpful to me in a whole bunch of different ways. And I think it's becoming a not so much of a secret, that she's a real scholar, and as well as a great teacher, and that she really knows her Dharma stuff in detail, because I ask her to correct my work. And she does. Okay. So now we know who the teacher is. Anyway, my perspective a little bit is that the obstacles that have been overcome in creating a situation like this include not only a long history of patriarchy on the one side, and exclusion and unequal inclusion, but also on the other side, now we have in the United States, sort of a question about what role does a monastic sangha have in the future of the Western Dharma. So it's got that's like Scylla and Charybdis, or two extreme. You have all two very different but very difficult kinds of obstacles to fight one's way through. And so that reflecting on that just increases my admiration for what Venerable Chodron has been able to accomplish. Now, in terms of myself, I've always been, for a long time, sort of somewhat obsessed with the two truths. I had another topic that was initially assigned to me in grad school by Jeffrey Hopkins, which was the six perfections, which was very nice. But it was all very nice. They're all very important. And I somehow it just didn't, though, grab hold of my mind in a way that's necessary to generate the persistence to write a dissertation, which is like over 1,000 pages. this book is only half of this. The Two Truths is only half of my dissertation. The other half hasn't been published yet, but we're still hoping Snow Lamb will come through with that back section. But in order to do that, I had to just be crazy and about not just somewhat interested. And Two Truths did that for me. And when I went to India to study there, one of my teachers, Genma Sen Gyatso, because of my behavior, just named me Denbani, which is the Two Truths instead. He just called. He was a joker, right? And he just assigned to me that name. There wasn't any ceremony. That was just you are the Two Truths. That was that was the only thing I would talk about. So I don't know. That seems like that's enough about my background. I was teaching at some other Dharma centers before, not a great deal. But one time I was teaching, it was about the Two Truths actually, and there were students come, and of course they have questions, and I only used to teaching university students who the main job at my university is to get them to be interested or to care. They're not that interested. So if I'm funny, and then I provoke them into being interested. And so that was my shtick, more or less. But then when it's the Dharma centers, of course, it's different. And there's one very sincere Dharma practitioner who said to me privately that all of the Buddha's teachings had been helpful to her, and she had felt benefited by practicing every teaching she had taken up except the Two Truths. And I was stunned, at a loss. I never had a question like that. I didn't know what to do with a question like that. So it's kind of I don't know, it's one of those things you never forget, right? I'd never forget that, because I didn't know what to say, really. I stammered around, made up some things, but. So anyway, that was one of my things for today, is to talk a little bit about the history of the Two Truths as I understand it in early Buddhism, but then in that context sort of say, well, what is the point of this? Why do we need this as a teaching in the Dharma? If you have a teaching on love, and you have a teaching on patience, and you have a teaching on things are empty, then why is that not sufficient? Why do you need some other thing about the Two Truths? It seems sort of redundant and superfluous, and not where's the sadhana? What's the cash value here? So that's what I'm going to try to talk about a little bit about how I see the background of the Two Truths, and then within the context of that, try to bring out how I would answer that question today. But before I do that, just real quickly, since it's the first of I gather 11 talks I'm going to give, I just thought I'd tell you quickly my plan, which I'm sure will not be followed, but it's still better to have one and that it be shared. So I made up the idea that today I would introduce the Two Truths, and that then this morning I'll introduce the Two Truths, and in the afternoon I would give a really quick overview, then jumping ahead to the Tsongkhapa's position, the Gelugpa interpretation. So today, in the morning, I'm going to start with sort of early stuff, and then we'll say, given that there are these kinds of problems and issues, well, how does Tsongkhapa, what are the framework of his position? And then go back and look at some of the non-Mahayana systems about the Two Truths in more depth. That would be coming out of the Appearance and Reality book, both Vaibhashika and Sautranika, and then the Chittamatra mind-only system. And then have a class where we look at some of the Indian Madhyamaka sources on the Two Truths. What does Nagarjuna say in some of his different texts? What does Aryadeva say? And so Buddhapalita, Bhaviveka, Shantideva, Chandrakirti. What are these guys in India? What are the sort of key facts? They don't have whole treatises about the Two Truths. It's a verse here, verse there, in all these different books. And so Really, someone could get it together to make the Two Truths anthology, and it wouldn't be very long, as long as you just stuck to the root text. But so then we'll go on to the rest of the classes. Maybe the last 6 classes will go into more detail on Tsongkhapa's system and the context for that system, and going through in detail, the chapters that in the Two Truths book about the basis of the division and so forth. Okay, so that's my outline. So let's now come to the point. Our teacher, the Buddha, taught that we suffer unnecessarily or needlessly because we don't see things as they are, and that's the heart of the matter. It's not that we have been ordained to be in misery. It's not that we have some intrinsic character, separate from being ordained or condemned by a superpower. It's not that we have something built into ourselves that requires that it be so. So in that way, suffering and misery is, I guess in the Western language you'd say tragic. It's unnecessary. It's needless to a great extent because it's not grounded in reality. It's grounded in a misapprehension of the actual nature of how things are. And so this is what's peculiar about Buddhism, is when you say, okay, well, all right, please tell me now, how are things so I can see it? And is it tell me the name of the God that is the real, or is it a capital R for reality, and then tell me where to find it, and then I will be free from this needless suffering. But the peculiarity of Buddhism, and among world religions, I mean, is that when you ask that question, well, how are things? Then you find that Buddha has said that things are impermanent, they're continuously disintegrating, they're ungraspable, they have no fixed nature, and it just really sounds negative to everybody, right? It's like, well, that's not what we were kind of looking to hear. I feel kind of like at sea and lost in the world already, and I was hoping you would give me the way to some really solid anchor that I could hold on to. And instead you're saying, well, this sea is bottomless, and this wilderness, is mapless, or something like that, And people just feel, maybe if you tell them that right away, then that doesn't make them come back, right? Do you know what I'm saying? That's maybe the idea of the 3 turnings of the wheel of the Dharma. Is the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma was like, well, we got to get these people worked in to the system here a little bit before we unload on them what the real problem is. So when His Holiness, I don't know, some of us were there in 2008 and somewhere when His Holiness was teaching the great treatise on the stages of the path to enlightenment. And it was quite remarkable that no matter what topic he talked about, it was always about emptiness. I mean, except when he was talking, including Muslims and Christians and so forth, then he would talk about dependent arising interconnectedness. But as soon as he went on to Buddhist topic, 3 jewels, it's really all about emptiness. 4 noble truths, you don't understand them if you don't understand emptiness. How to meditate on compassion, well, you're just doing it in kind of the baby way unless you really are understanding emptiness. And so forth. Like, every single thing was like that. It's like, well, it was kind of a genius way of teaching the book, which is, in some sense, as he acknowledged at the beginning, unteachable in that amount of time. And so he took one idea and said, this is really the heart of Buddhism. And, you say you're going to the 3 jewels for refuge, but, other Muslims and Christians and that we're all friends with, they have their teachers and they have their Dharma-like traditions and they have their Sangha-like church communities and clerics and saints, assemblies of saints. And what makes Buddhism different from that? In fact, he usually emphasizes how much it has in common with all these things in terms of, and tells people, don't convert to Buddhism well, you know, unless you've done it very thoughtfully and you're sure that that's right, because there's so much of value that, in terms of developing the good heart within your own tradition, and there's these cultural challenges and psychological difficulties in changing tradition. So he's usually emphasizing these similarities, but then when he turns to say, okay, what is Buddhism about? Well, it's about emptiness. It's got all the things about love and compassion, but those are in other religions too. And it's got 3 jewels, but other things have things that are like the 3 jewels. And what it's got to be Buddhist 3 jewels, it has to be understanding these things in relationship to emptiness. So this is the, I don't know, inescapable, I think, distinctive, profound thing. To me, this is what makes, I don't know, I guess Yeshe Rapin said, you know, emptiness isn't sacred. It's just everywhere, like, you know, more than air, more than dirt, more than space, I don't know, at least as much as space. It's everywhere, you know, it's like all pervasive, and it's not holy in that sense, but a teaching of emptiness, understanding of emptiness, a mind that knows emptiness, this is like a very rare and precious thing. It's like somebody saying, you know, you have, you know, needlessly imprisoned yourself, and by the way, the key is in your left pocket. You know, I was like, well, that's like really important information to have. So I don't know. As I said, it could have been a lot of people react negatively, right, to the very word emptiness, and you know, my friend, this late friend, Roger Corliss, insisted on calling it transparency. And I noticed that Bob Thurman will sometimes just, when he's talking to general audiences who don't have any background, he'll just talk about relatedness or relativity, and he won't say the word, he won't say the E word. You know? And I've had students who are teaching is saying, well, you say emptiness means that, like, the same as dependent arising, it means that everything is like connected to everything else and not existing in itself. Well, why don't you call it fullness instead? Because then people would be happier, you know, and they would maybe buy more Dharma goods or something. I don't know. It's like, it's not a marketing slogan. We're trying to attack a fundamental misconception that you have, and it's the root of your needless misery, and that misconception goes in the direction of exaggerating things, of making it seem that things have a kind of solidity that they don't have, and making things seem that things have some ability to set themselves up that they don't actually have. And so you have to have, if you're going to be honest about it, and you're going to be therefore helpful about it, right, you have to have something that goes against the grain, that's going to at some point chafe a little bit with people and start to expose them to something that they're clinging to, that they're going to have to let go of. But it's not like, you know, as I said, the Buddha is wagging his finger at us and telling us that we shouldn't cling. It's just that there's nothing to cling to. These things don't have a handle of their own nature or their own. They're not graspable. If things really were graspable and we could grasp onto them and then be happy, then Buddhism would be very bad teaching. Like, to say, don't grasp, and it's, oh yeah, but if we did grasp, we would be happy. It's like, there's all these graspable things, and you're telling us not to grasp. It's like, well, it's not like that at all. Things don't even have any, they're not able to be grasped. This idea that we can hold on to something, it's already gone. It's already gone. It's like things are constantly rushing past and disappearing. Yeah. Jack Kerouac said it's like sitting on the back of a moving truck with the door up and you're looking backwards. Everything's going, it's just being, I don't know, that's kind of bleak. But so anyway, you've got this idea of emptiness, and then you have, in this context, you know, Buddha is saying yes, and therefore it's really important that you maintain restraint of your behavior and to start with not harming others. And then when you develop some, you know, degree of restraint, then cultivate love and compassion and the good heart, you know, goodwill towards others, and actively go out to help them. And I thought you said they were just empty. And there's the thing. There's what I'm getting to. right? This is why you need the doctrine of the true truth, the teaching of the true truth, right? Is because what does it mean to say, in truth, in reality, right? From the point of view of the nature of things, there's nothing to grab onto. There's nothing that that has any existence of itself. There's nothing there. But on the other hand, it's really important to maintain these rules and to be compassionate towards these people who have such and such kinds of suffering. Which people are those? You just said that these people are fictions. That's very difficult for people to understand. It's not just difficult for one or two people to understand. It's difficult for everybody to understand. And I think that this is my understanding when I wrote this book a long time ago, right? Is that the tension between emptiness and ethics, the tension between compassion and wisdom, however you want to put it, the tension between saying we should follow these rules very strictly, and we should therefore restrain our behavior, and we should cultivate love and compassion because other beings are suffering, and we should try to help them. And on the other hand, saying from the point of view of ultimate reality, there isn't any form, there isn't any. You just chanted it, in emptiness. There is no, and then everything is listed, up through from our bodies up through Buddha's omniscient mind. It's like, well, was there something left out that you haven't told me about that is the non-empty thing that I'm going to be able to hold on to? No, it's like that wasn't the idea. It's like all these things are empty. So how can that be? And I wasn't unself-conscious enough to write this in my dissertation, right? But I thought of this when I was writing it a long time ago as like the matter-antimatter reactor in the Starship Enterprise, and that like what drives Buddhist thought forward, what drives the history of, the evolving is like, why are there different shastras that keep appearing, and why do people write more books? Is because they're trying to clarify and get a clearer way of talking about how these two things relate to each other, right? And there's a lot of different ways, and so you have a lot of different flavors of Dharma that are based on what people are going to say about, because they're going to have to say that compassion and wisdom are both fundamental, but they're going to have to then, at some point, they're going to have to say something about why this, how this can be. I was going to say how it's not a contradiction, but some of them could say it is a contradiction, and that's good. That could be a way. That is a way, right, that you could do it. Or you could say, yeah, contradiction is in the nature of the universe, and it's a mystery of things that truth is contradictory, and we embrace the contradiction of compassion and wisdom. And a bodhisattva is a hero that she or he is able to embrace the contradiction of being compassionate and wisdom at the same time. And that was what Edward Kanza, who did all his translation of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras into English, that's what he thought. That's what he believed, that's what he wrote. Is that that's really what the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras were about. Right? And I say that in the first chapter of my book. And so other people obviously have different ways, and Tsongkhapa's way was about trying to say, no, we can explain this. You just have to be a little more patient, and read the texts a little. Well, I'm trying to look. The Diamond Sutra says, and yet, although innumerable beings have been led to nirvana, no being at all has been led to nirvana. I mean, you can't blame a person for reaching the Kanza position after they read a bunch of stuff like that, which is exactly what he did. He translated all of this stuff, and it was all like that, right? So then you think, well, that's very impressive that Tsongkhapa can take all of these kinds of things and explain them in a way that we can sort of say, oh, that actually makes sense, instead of just being a mystery that I have to accept. Yeah. Okay, so that's one of the, I don't know, this goes in the direction of answering my question, or the question of the student doesn't fully answer it, but it goes in the direction of answering it, and then he's saying that it's like, well, it's not in some sense a first order teaching, it's a teaching that helps you understand how to put the other teachings together without getting confused and mixed up. And I think that, anyway, we'll come back to that. But, so, let's look back at what we find in some of the early sources about the two truths in Buddhist history. I think there's this amazing passage. This isn't in anything that I've written, published yet. Some of the stuff I'm going to use here in the next few minutes is from an article that Tom Tillemans and I wrote introducing the two truths in a book called Moon Shadows that's coming out this year, I think from Oxford University Press. And we quote this passage from the Pali Canon, from the Samyutta Nikaya. It's really quite extraordinary to think about, like, well, where would Chandrakirti disagree with this? Where would Tsongkhapa think that, why is this a first turning, is this not a teaching of emptiness? Because it sounds, like it's going very close. Those who go by names, who go by concepts, those who make their abode in names and concepts, fail to discern the naming process, and they are subject to the reign of death. He who has discerned the naming process does not suppose that the one who names exists. No such case exists for him in truth, whereby one could say, he's this or that. I said, that's pretty, didn't use the word no self, doesn't use the word emptiness, but it's explaining that, like, well, we have a fundamental misperception, a fundamental misunderstanding of how things exist, which cause us to be subject to the reign of death. We suffer needlessly because of this misunderstanding, and we become free by only understanding it. And also it says that, the person who understands it sees that in truth there is no case, there's no situation where you can, like, say, in reality, this thing is this or that thing is that. That sounds like emptiness. And also, he doesn't explain emptiness, the Buddha here in Samyutta Nikaya. He doesn't explain it in terms of things being parts and wholes. He doesn't explain it in terms of things arising from, causes and conditions that existed in the past. It's just the naming process, that things are dependent imputations, because we don't understand that things are mentally designated or conceptually imputed. But that's what he's taking as the meaning of that which we need to understand in order to be free from the reign of death. It sounds a lot like emptiness. It's almost like you could say, well, how is that different from 2418 in the Madhyamaka Karikas, where Nagarjuna says the middle way is where dependent arising and emptiness mean the same thing, and that's what we call dependent imputation. So when you really understand dependent arising is dependent imputation, then you really understand the profound meaning of emptiness, and that's precisely the middle way. It sounds very much like, it sounds like the same thing. I was thinking, well, what would be missing in here is that, if anything, it's that it seems to be focusing on the person. That is, it doesn't say that every single thing in the universe is merely an imputation or merely a mental designation or merely a name. It says, there are some things, such as the person, which are mentally imputed and designated, but we falsely take them as though they had some concrete reality of their own. And but what he doesn't say, what doesn't say in the Samyutta Nikaya is, yeah, and behind that mental imputation, there's some more fundamental things, but when you try to grab onto them, they're all mental imputations too. And in fact, every single thing in the universe is a mental imputation. It doesn't say that, right? So you can say, well, that's why it's not a Mahayana Sutra, that's why it's in the Pali Canon. But yeah, when you read it, it's like you get the hair goes up, It's like, oh, I think that's Buddha teaching emptiness in the Pali Canon. Anyway, that was the way I felt. So, then what else? There's no such case. No such case exists for him in truth, whereby one could say he's this or that. That's Samyutta Nikaya. Then, over in the Anguttara Nikaya, Buddha tells us that there was one person who was born out of compassion for the world, and this person himself got up and went out of compassion for others to help them, out of sympathy for the world. What happened to there's no such case why you can say that any person is this or that in the other Nikaya. That's my point. That's why you have the teaching of the true truths, because people are like, well, wait a minute, he said that, you know, what are we supposed to do with that? There's another, you find in the Pali Canon, you know, passages where the Buddha doesn't say in the Pali Canon, these are the two truths, okay? But he talks about ultimate ways of looking at things and conventional ways of looking at things that form the basis for that idea, you know, foreshadow that idea, you could say, allude to that idea. And here's a passage like that from the Samyutta Nikaya. Bonds are gone for him without conceits, all delusions, chains are cast aside. Truly wise, he's gone beyond such thoughts, in other words, an enlightened person. That monk might still use words like I. That person might still say, they call this mine, well aware of common worldly speech. A person like that could speak conforming to such usage. Okay, so you have, this isn't, you say a passage like this, it doesn't say there are two truths, but it's telling you, you know, okay, even that person who understands the naming process and knows that there's no such case by which you can, in truth, by which you can say he's this or that, that person can still going around talking about, I was sitting underneath the tree and then I got up from underneath the tree and so forth, right? But, you know, it's sort of suggesting that that's being done as a concession to others and not from the point of view of how things are really. Anyway, so you have these kind of two levels of discourse that are operating, and then you have Buddha talking, even in the Pali Canon, about something that sounds like, you know, that there are these two levels of discourse. One that's like talking about things how they are in truth or in reality, and then another way that sort of conforms to worldly usage. So the idea of the two truths initially in early Buddhism seems to have been a construct for reconciling, just as I've been saying, contradictory or apparently contradictory statements in the scripture based on, you know, what was the intent of the teacher in saying that particular passage. And in that way, you know, you can see a parallel in the development of the idea of the two truths to the development of the distinction between the definitive scriptures and the scriptures requiring interpretation. Not everybody had these, you know, there's the definitive and the requiring interpretation, and then there's the ultimate truth or ultimate reality or what's seen from an ultimate point of view, and then there's the conventional mode of discourse. So these two pairs were all used from early Buddhism in different ways, and sometimes people said these mean exactly the same thing, and sometimes they said they didn't, but they were both sort of functioning as exegetical tools. That means how we read the word of Buddha, how we interpret the word of Buddha, and make sense of why it seems to be saying, like pointing us in one direction in one place and another direction in another place. As far as the actual two truths, you know, being taught directly, Buddhaghosa, you know, Pali, you know, Theravada interpreter, did say that from his point of view, the Buddha did teach the two truths. And he has a passage, I'll read a quick passage from Buddhaghosa that's very similar to a lot of things you see in Mahayana. The enlightened one, the best of all teachers, taught two truths, conventional and ultimate, and we don't see any third one. But then he identifies the two truths as statements, which is different from what we're going to see in Tsongkhapa. A statement governed purely by agreement is true by the world's conventions, and an ultimate statement is true in that it characterizes things as they are, right? And so that's very clear that the two truths in that is, for him, in Theravada, an exegetical tool for trying to say, here's a statement from Buddha, it's like this, here's another statement from Buddha, it's like that. How are we going to sort, how are we not to be confused as the students, right? And I think that this is how, I don't know, a lot of people understand in that same sense Mula Madhyamaka Karika's 24.8, where Nagarjuna says, the teachings of the Buddha's teaching of the Dharma relies upon, is based upon two truths, the conventional truth of the world and what is true from an ultimate, what is true ultimately, let's say, like that. That this was similarly, you know, not being used by Nagarjuna to say you have to have a way of interpreting what the Buddha said that's grounded in this understanding two different maybe modes of discourse or two different ways of talking. And otherwise you will definitely be confused, and you'll have your practice of compassion and your practice of the first perfections being in contradiction to and working at cross purposes to your practice of wisdom in the sixth perfection. Right? So it seems that then, of course, in the Mahayana sutras, that the Buddha teaches explicitly about the two truths and teaches the two truths. And of course that's not unusual, because in Mahayana sutras you also have the Buddha teaching other exegetical devices besides the two truths. In other words, it doesn't mean that it's not an exegetical device because it's in the scripture, sutra itself. Buddha, teaches the three turnings of the wheel of the doctrine, which serves in a similar way as like a way to make sense out of interpret apparent contradictions between the scripture. So the devices for interpreting scripture, that is exegetical frameworks, are taught in the sutras themselves. and His Holiness at the teachings that we were at in Lehigh, he said, well, what is a person to do? You read this sutra and it gives you this exegetical framework for interpreting the other sutras, but when you read the other sutra, it gives you a different set of exegetical instructions, and then what meta-exegetical instruction are you supposed to use to decide which sutra gives you the proper set of exegetical instructions for reading the other sutras? He said that. He didn't say meta-exegetical, but he said that exact same thing. I was like, exactly. What is he going to say now? And he said, use reason. In other words, you can't just say, ooh, this sutra says this. That's it. Because then, another sutra says something different. And you're going to have to think. You have to think. That's the teaching of His Holiness. So a little bit quickly about this exegetical way of looking at the two truths, and then go on to say something about a different way of looking at it, and then come around back to the question of what the point of it is. So when Buddha is speaking, or in Scripture there's statements that are made from the point of view of worldly convention, then it seems the idea is that these are done in a compassionate, skillful way that's harmonizing or conforming to the way the world, that is the non-yogic person, is looking at things. Okay, so I have that's the first thing I wanted to say. And so I have a great little story. I don't know why I love this story so much. This is from Buddhapalita's commentary on Nagarjuna. Two villagers are passing through a city on business. They enter a temple. They're tourists. They're not pilgrims. They're passing. They enter the temple. That's a big sight in the city. As they begin examining the paintings, one remarked, the one that has the trident, that's Narayana, that's Vishnu. And the other one with the discus, that's Maheshvara, that's Shiva. And the other one says, no, you've got it totally wrong. Maheshvara has the trident and Narayana has the discus. I was really interesting that they're saying this, because that suggests that they're not pointing, as they're describing. Anyway, as they argue, they're arguing about, which is Shiva, which is Vishnu. They're arguing. They come upon a nearby wandering sage. They paid their respects, and each explained his opinion. So to one of them, the sage, this is the one that says that Shiva has the trident. To one of them, the sage replied, "What you say is true." And to the other, he said, "What you say is not true." Now, the sage knows that neither God is present. These are just paintings on the wall. He's not taking them to be gods in the way the villagers are taking them to be gods. But he's not lying. This is in Buddhapalita, but I'm paraphrasing. He doesn't lie when he answers the villagers, because, quote, what he says to them is true through the force of worldly conventions. The story uses this as a big metaphor to explain how the Buddha teaches us. Like the sage talking to the villagers, the Buddha employs distinctions between right and wrong, true and false, real and unreal, within a conventional framework that may be quite different from his own profound understanding of emptiness to guide us toward, freedom and towards the kind of condition to which he's attained. So that's the way Buddha teaches it. It's like very much a kind of sense that this is a skillful, compassionate concession to the limitations of a worldly way of understanding things. And why do you have to do that? Is because of the limitations of our way of understanding things. The teacher can't just speak from the point of view of the ultimate. And Aryadeva, Nagarjuna's follower, his immediate disciple, writes in the 400, the famous passage, just as you can't make a barbarian understand by any language other than his or her own, so too ordinary persons cannot be made to understand without using what is mundane. So it's like you have to use our way of looking at the world to talk to us about the world. It's like, I guess if a skillful teacher came in here and just like manifested something, we would be inspired, but we wouldn't necessarily be able to realize ourselves unless they make a connection to our way of thinking, which is dualistic, our way of understanding things, which is conceptual. It's not direct, non-dualistic conceptual. It's like, well, there isn't sort of a technique for taking direct, non-dualistic conceptual realization from the Buddha's mind and like just implanting it into our minds. So how is it to be done? Buddha has to skillfully use where we are now and move us along from that point. So this is similarly this kind of pedagogical, bringing people along compassionately by using the conventional as a way to lead people toward the ultimate. That's exactly what you get in Nagarjuna's treatise on the middle way, Mula Madhyamaka Karika's 2410, where he says the ultimate is not taught without. He talks about the two truths in 2 verses before, and then in 2410 he says the ultimate is not taught without depending on the conventional, and one won't attain nirvana without having understood the ultimate. So you get kind of this, apparently 3-tier thing where you have to have the conventional. Why? Because you have to have that to get to the ultimate. When you realize the ultimate nature of things, then you're liberated. So it's like, well, if we could just be liberated without bothering with these conventional fictions, then that would be fine. But unfortunately, we need them, just like you need to, speak barbarian language. If you're talking to a barbarian, you need these dualistic conceptual things in order to help the person get to realizing the ultimate nature, which without seeing of which they'll continue to suffer needlessly. That is, they'll be stuck in the reign of death, if you go by the Samyutta Nikaya way of saying it. Okay, so that's the exegetical way of thinking about it. And you can see that it's like all over the place. It's not just, we could go farther, but it's not like a minor thing. It's a big aspect of how the two truths are represented from early sources, Theravada sources, and Madhyamaka sources. You see this kind of, there's a tiering, you could say, in other words, that the conventional is a stepping stone to get to the ultimate. And it's a sort of like the teacher is taking a step down in order to get to us, like that. So it's not like two equal truths, right? That's the idea. That's the point. Okay, so then there's another way of thinking about it, which gets mixed with, overlaid with, integrated with this way in different combinations, in different texts, in different teachers. And this, I don't know, we could call, if we wanted, a philosophical differentiation of the two truths, or I don't know exactly what the right word is, but not exegetical. In other words, instead of saying there's like one way of talking which we have to talk to beginners, and then there's the ultimate reality, which is what's really true, there's another way of thinking about the two truths in which saying there's two kinds of things that exist. There's conventional realities and their ultimate reality. That is, there are people, there is compassion, there is suffering, right? That's one kind of thing that exists. How does it exist? It exists as a conceptual designation. It exists as something that's been named. it's been imputed. But having been imputed, yeah, okay, so then it exists. And then there's another way of another kind of existence, and that's something that's somehow irreducible, something that's there apart from being, something that one finds with the mind when one searches to see what things ultimately are, would be the most neutral way to say it, although it's complicated, right? And so there's something that you find when you say, what are things really? And then there's other things that also exist, even though when you ask what are they really, you don't come to them. Okay, so you can think, well, that still sounds like the same thing, because there's some things that aren't there really, and there's some things that are. Yeah, but maybe not exactly. It's like if you're willing to say that there are two kinds of existence, two kinds of aspects, two kinds of dimensions to things, and both exist. It's not like the one is completely obliterated and destroyed by the other. It's more like there's two kinds of things that are there, and there's one kind of thing that you see when you look very deeply, but that's not the only kind of thing that exists. Okay? I have to think about it. You have to open your mind, because that's really different from the other way. But that kind of position is detectable, even in early Buddhism, and it's really important for understanding Tsongkhapa.